Hello everyone, welcome back to the last deck, which I'm going to go through here for the first ever Disney Lorcana Challenge here, set 3, Into the Inklands, and, of course, Steel Songs. Steel Songs is something I've played the majority of for the format. It's something I had the most familiarity with by a long shot. It's a deck that I've loved and I've been frustrated with at times from both perspectives, sometimes playing against it, sometimes playing with it, depending on the matchup. There's a lot of variations of this deck. I think people have tried Pride Land, Sleepy's Flute, and Lantern. There's two versions I'm going to go through today, the one that are more viable. And the first one is going to be the one that I think I've most known for and kind of, really would like to be playing this weekend in Atlanta. And it's something I'm really trying to make sure I have either all the right tools to make it successful, and kind of going through some of the choices that are kind of what's influencing my choices here to make certain deck pieces in the deck. So we're down to 60 cards. That's to start. The inclusion of the Ruby Sapphire decks with cards like How Far I'll Go has made decking a lot easier when you don't have to rely on having more cards than them in any way. Not that that's our primary game plan, because it's very unlikely that the decking aspect of that game plan matchup comes up, because you have to make sure that you never draw 2 copies of a whole new world, which isn't really something you can control. It happens, and you can play around it in some way by playing whole new worlds immediately if you can. Early in the game, to make sure that you never have 2 while holding 1. You don't draw a bunch of cards while you have 1 in your hand. You kind of be very frugal with any card draw effects like Storm or Rapunzel. Not really even Ariel utilizing them until you've seen all the copies you need or don't have 1 in general. But down to 60 cards, that's the important place to start. We have a smattering of 1-cost characters. I've gone, Cinderella and Robin Hood are, I think, the staples. 4 Cinderella, 4 Robin Hood, 4 Robin Hood Champion of Stalwart or Sherwood, the big one, and 3 Cinderella Stout-Hearted. Those are kind of the package deal for how the deck plays out. 4 copies of Ariel. I'm going here with 3 copies of Queen, the small queen and the big queen. I've tried any number of additional things in that slot, and every time I decide to put maybe a smaller character like Smee in the deck, or cards like Piglet even, to get really aggressive against Ruby Sapphire, because that's the one matchup that you don't want to face with this deck, none of it really works. None of it really plays out how it's supposed to, and you kind of get stuck in a position where your deck isn't really doing the same things it wants to against a lot of the other decks. This deck preys upon a lot of the Emerald decks. Anyone who's probably telling you that Emerald Steel or Emerald Amethyst Emerald Steel, some people think they like the matchup because you have the ability to take Whole New World and kind of pressure them with things they can't answer, and the amount of grab swords are definitely getting reduced. As you can see, only 2 here in the list I would play. This is certainly something that has led people to believe in a lot of ways that the Emerald decks are favored, but asking a lot of the experienced players, this is one of the decks they absolutely do not want to play against. They want to play on the Ruby Sapphire decks. They want to play on some of the other big decks or clunkier decks, or even mirror matches or Ruby Amethyst. This is something they don't want to play against. This deck, I'm not going to lie, the matchup against Ruby Sapphire is demoralizing to play, no matter what you try and do, really, with this deck. I think Lantern's the best way to do this variant of the deck in general, for the format as a whole, but your matchup against Ruby Sapphire is not good, and if you win, you can come up and give me a high five at any time during the event, because it is hard. And I think that the choices that really define the Lantern variant of Steel Song is Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, which has an excellent time against all the Emerald decks playing Curse Merfolk, and all any of the Amethyst decks. Really, they rely on the fact that most of their characters dodge cards like Grab Your Swords. When it comes to Merlin Rabbit, Merlin Crab, Merlin Goat, Mims, all of them are 3 health. So Tinkerbell combining with Grab Your Swords is one of the key ways that this deck kind of preys upon those types of decks. Ruby Amethyst is a close matchup. There's a lot of ways to look at it, and the flute variation, where there's 3 to 4 flutes in the deck, have a better time against that matchup, because they can play a similar game plan for grinding the early game there with a lot of their card draw effects, and maybe have cards like Castle to close out, which this deck does struggle a little bit with locations. I wouldn't go as far as to add cards like Rise of the Titans to this deck. You really need to keep your songs count high for Ariel, and that card doesn't really do too much. You might as well play more Along Came Zeus's if you're trying to fight castles a bit more. But cards to kind of go through beyond that, Benja is just a concession to the fact that there's sometimes an item you want to kill. Killing a Quill definitely makes your life a lot easier when you're playing on holding world your opponent. They don't often have the ability or time to develop a second one if their first one gets removed. And against flutes, being able to take those out is pretty nice. Not many other decks have too many items. Occasionally you may see an airfoil, you may see just a popsicle you want to take out. Maybe you snag a lucky dime at the right time when there's no Tamato around, and it works out really well for you. But Bendra's is kind of a catch-all. It's not necessary for the deck. I've definitely tried where that Bendra slot was just too smees to be a little bit more front-footed and aggressive. But I've liked the Bendra. I think it's reasonable. It sings the songs that we have here pretty well. Rapunzel, one of the key cards in this deck. Amber, probably Amber's best card, close to it. Maybe Ariel's the best one, but Rapunzel is a close second, if anything. Just the incredible draw power it offers, and it's never really dead in any kind of matchup there. Going back to Benja and Ariel being staples of this deck, they both have 3 health, which conveniently can survive your own copy of the Storm Rage on, and those 2 cards can sing Let the Storm Rage on. So often a play pattern is I've shot my own character with Storm by singing it on turn 3, and then on turn 4 just use my Rapunzel to draw 2. So I've turned my Rapunzel and the Storm Rage on into 3 new cards. Something you certainly want to be aware of when playing this deck is the ability to target your own characters. I've gone as far as to shoot my own Robin Hood with a Long Came Zeus. It's happened many times, and something you can certainly do, even in the face of characters you may want to kill sometimes. It's usually the right play to kind of power through, especially against Ruby Amethyst, not whole new worlding at certain times. One of the key parts to the deck, and I think the reason for the Lantern inclusion, is Beast Tragic Hero. I've gone between 3 and 4 a lot, and I'm not certain which one's correct. I like 3, but I definitely can see 4 being the correct number here. And one of the key reasons to run Lantern is because of how good Beast is against Ruby Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst has a lot of ways to control the board. Outside of Pinocchio and Medusa, however, and Be Prepared, of course, they don't have any ways to really touch Beast Tragic Hero. And what Lantern does is, even when going second, guarantees that you're still going to be able to draw at least 1 card from Beast before it dies to a Medusa, just how the turns line up. When going second, if you don't have a Lantern, you're going to get your Beast immediately hit by a Medusa. But in games where you're potentially going first and develop a Beast on turn 4, that's 3 full turns before Ruby Amethyst can even touch the Beast before they play Medusa, if they don't have Pinocchio and enough things to challenge it, which isn't that easy, because their game plan usually does not revolve around playing Rafiki early, unless they have Pinocchio already kind of at the ready to challenge a Cinderella. Your Storms kind of check that part of their deck a bit. But Beast is a big inclusion, and I think one that, if Beast had a 4th point of power, would probably be one of the best cards in the game, but the fact that it hits my Medusa is a nice check for how good that card is. But solid card, and one of the reasons to play this deck, I think, is the inclusion of Beast Tragic Hero, and why I like Lantern so much, because Beast utterly decimates the Emerald Amethyst decks, the green-purple decks. It's one of the cards that they don't have removal in their deck. They rely solely on Mother Knows Best, really, to help control the board and challenging. But Beast is something that just sits in play. The longer it sits, the more likely it is to find more Tinkerbells, which are amazing against the Emerald Amethyst decks. The more likely it's to find Grab Swords or other songs just to clear the board. And this deck wants to play against Emerald Amethyst more than anything else. If I could guarantee that I'm playing against that 4 of the 9 rounds, I would play this deck in a heartbeat, not think twice. But I think I may play a little bit less number of those and maybe more Ruby Amethyst, which I think Ruby Amethyst, again, is about 50-50 for how the games play out. Not necessarily being 50-50 because of the die roll, but because of just how sometimes the draws line up against each other. You're really looking for, when going first, of course, the early shift, Whole New World lines. Robin Hood's particularly good in the early game there. Gets worse as the game goes on. But Cinderella also can survive a Maui hit, and that's something that most decks can't really say. And Cinderella also is much more likely to live nowadays against Ruby Amethyst because they've cut down on the number of Lady Tremaines they have. Still probably see about 2 per deck, but most of us are also not playing any copies of Maleficent Dragon. Those cards were super predatory for Cinderella, and one of the reasons to kind of avoid it in the Ruby Sapphire matchups is because they have 4 copies of Maleficent Dragon. Sure, it gets hit by Be Prepared, but everything does. But Cinderella being able to actually kind of combat that matchup is another reason I think this deck has gotten a lot better. And the more and more I see people play and talk about things online in this past week alone, the more I've seen people with Ruby Sapphire decks just kind of getting beat up by all the Emerald decks, all the Steel decks, all the Emerald decks. They're kind of toying with Ruby Sapphire, so there's a chance that opens up a window for this deck to be really good. And one of the reasons it's kind of built to my side here, it's already ready to go. My deck box, but I'm not sure. I'm still haven't made a full decision here on Thursday. I will by tomorrow. Kind of put out what I'm playing for certain, and it may be this. The one copy of World's Greatest Criminal Mind is a card I don't like. It could easily be another Long Came Zeus, but the inkable count is something to be concerned with. And often this can just be inked and have an impact on a match, because against most decks, it really only has 2 targets really in the game that get played. Cinderella Stouthearted for any kind of mirror matches you might play, as well as Tamatoa. Those are the two cards you primarily use this to deal with, and those are two cards that most of your other songs can't touch. And even inking this kind of makes them maybe think twice about playing their large character out when they might lose the game if it just gets killed immediately. They don't know that you're only running one. You can maybe run two, but they don't know. I wouldn't play more than one. Kind of have it when it's good, maybe, and if it works out, you get lucky with it. It's great. But it's a card that I think some versions of Steel Song have played more of when they're less aggressive and want to be more controlling. But Tinkerbell kind of leads me to the more controlling route, as does Lantern in some ways, and being able to fight. Of course, it can hit Maui and Scar, things like that. And with the Queen, it can potentially hit anything. But I would say in the 400 or 500 games this format I've played with this variant of the deck, it hasn't happened more than maybe 2 or 3 times in total. It's something that comes up, but I think often maybe kind of a trap to try and do sometimes. It may be just better to be held for an actual big character, but it can happen. Other versions of this deck I played have had only 3 copies of Let the Storm Rage on, but one reason I went up to 4 for the most recent build here is because every time people ask why to play Steel Song, I say one of the most powerful interactions you can do is Cinderella plus Let the Storm Rage on. It checks any 1-cost character really, and it really just kind of propels you, and it's really good going second. That being said, it getting snagged by an Ursula when you lead on Cinderella is kind of tough, but that shouldn't really deter me from playing the card or not wanting to keep it. I should just be playing more. So when I went from 3 to 4, I was much happier with that aspect, because a lot of times you're looking to chain things together, and Let the Storm Rage on is one of the few cards that actually just draws a card by itself. So I'm up to 4 Storms, 3 Strengths, and 2 Zeuses, with the 3rd Zeus potentially having been a World's Greatest, but I think the inkable count is something I was a little more concerned with. 4 Hole in the Worlds, of course. One of the best reasons to play the deck is get to Hole in the World your opponent either out of the game or yourself back into the game. Grab Your Swords, I could see playing up to 3, but it would come at the cost of some of their uninkable, which the last 2 cards here, Lantern is a staple there, and 1 Sleepy's Flute. So I don't really like Flute, and as a rule, I think it's not great. Particularly, I think my disdain comes from the fact that in the mirror match, the card is much worse. And I say that not in the sense that the cards in play are worse. It's that the way that the deck with those cards in it are constructed, the deck with Lantern is constructed in a way so that it is advantaged in a steel mirror match. Typically, the deck that is a little bit slower and a little bit bigger across any card game is usually advantaged. We saw that, in our early days of Magic up until now. The hyper aggressive decks are a little bit vulnerable to the decks that are a little bit slower but much bigger. You're playing your 2/2s into your opponent's 3/3s. Sure, their 3/3s cost 2, but they kind of invalidate your 2/2s. So even if you have 2, you're still only trading for 1. So that thought of which one is better, I think that when you talk about which one's better against Ruby Amethyst, I think the decks that play Lantern are better suited to beat Ruby Amethyst as a whole. However, Sleepiest Flute's a better card to have in play against that deck. So I'm trying to make an important distinction between the cards themselves being better in the matchup, or the cards or the decks that those cards are in being better in the matchup. So that's why when people ask me which one's better, I always say Lantern, because I think that the deck itself is better against Ruby Amethyst more so than the card itself. And I don't think you can construct the deck the same way with Sleepy's Flute as you can with Lantern, because you have to, I don't think you can play Tragic Hero Beast. I don't think you can play, Tinkerbell, because they're so expensive, and you might not get them in those matchups, and your game plan is completely different. To think that they're just different versions of the same deck is wrong. You really need to think of them as 2 completely different decks. And which deck is better positioned for a specific metagame, it really depends on what you expect to face. So I'm playing 1 Sleepy's Flute in this deck, and the reason being is I'm treating it much like, more so, I'm not considering this a flute deck. This isn't a flute deck. This is a deck with a Sleepy's Flute, much like we see often Ruby Amethyst play a single copy of Sorcerer's Spellbook, a card I also don't really like or advise playing. This deck has a Hole in the World, so it can kind of cheat on those type of cards because you're able to have draw 7s, where in Ruby Amethyst you're kind of grinding with every single card. This deck you're going to throw away a lot of cards half the time anyway, so it's less impactful to have a dead card in this deck versus a deck like Ruby Amethyst, where it's making use of every single card. It wants to play all of its cards. It doesn't really have a throwaway card in its deck, oddly enough, because it's trying to control the board and play Be Prepared. But this deck isn't trying to do that. The Sleepiest Flute in this deck is similar analog to why people have played a single copy of Spellbook in a lot of Amethyst decks. It's not going to be a ton of lore, but it can, in certain situations when drawn, close a game out. And you can often, against Ruby Sapphire, get to a certain point where you just need a few more points of lore and they can lock you out of the game pretty effectively with dragons, Tremaines, Be Prepared, Medusas, all these things, and then close the door really quickly. But Sleepiest Flute might be enough to kind of push you across the finish line. It's won a few games for me here and there, and it's something I would be playing in this deck if I choose to run this version. But kind of moving along in the vein of Sleepiest Flute, the other deck is a Sleepiest Flute variant. Now it's a little bit different. We've seen, I think, Lorcana Bro, I think, was the one who in the last online T event did pretty well with it. In that version, they only played 3 Sleepiest Flute. I think before the event, I was thinking on stream that only 3 Sleepiest Flute might be correct because it is clunky, but it's really just a way to end the game, and being front-footed is what this deck wants to do. Now, some of the differences from this deck and some of the other versions of it, the key ones I would say is the 2 copies of Piglet and the 1 extra copy of Cinderella. So we're back to the shift lines, Cinderella, the Queen, Hood, and the Queen, the Hood. Those are just the best ones, the most efficient ones for their cost. And we're going 4 and 4 Queen because our game plan is much different in this deck than it is in this deck. This deck wants to play with its food more, play a beast, so it doesn't rely on early parts of the shift line as much, why there's only 3 of each, and you have to make room for these cards somehow. But with that being said, 4 in this deck is kind of more efficient. You're really trying to stay on the front foot at all times. The Piglets in this deck, the one way you should look at this card, Piglet, is really that it's a Pinocchio, it's a Simba, the 2-cost 3 lower characters. It is that card at all times. It's inkable. It's better than both those, almost in every instance. It dies to a lot of things, but it's also a captain which can help with Smee. That's why there's Smees in this deck, to be more aggressive and trying to help get that early lore gain out to where Flute can just close the game. And that's how you're really utilizing this card. It is a Flute deck. It is certainly a Flute deck, but it's utilizing some of the early characters' questing potential really to leverage the power of Flute into the late game. And I think making sure that your draw is a little bit less clunky by only playing 3 versus 4, since it's an uninkable card that doesn't help you forward your game plan. And it's not a card you typically would keep in any matchup, maybe against Ruby Sapphire, but even then, I want to be deploying and getting a Hold World off on turn 2. I want to be doing it on turn 3. I want to be progressing my game plan very aggressively with Piglet and Smee. Flute is not really turn 2 play that often. It is if you have nothing else to do, maybe, but it's not something you're looking to play over almost any, even a second 1-cost character, one of the 2s, or even sometimes a Bare Necessities you want to play over playing a Flute. But this deck is much more aggressive, and it does have a much better Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Ruby Sapphire matchup, I believe, than the Lanterns as a whole. But Ruby Amethyst is a little more susceptible to cards like Tinkerbell and Grab Your Swords, which, again, there's only 2 Grab Your Swords to kind of, again, play front-footed. We see the full copy of 4 songs like we saw in Green Steel, and 1 more than we saw in the Amber Steel deck just a moment ago. An extra copy of Zeus, and no World's Greatest Criminal Mind, because going back to the fact that World's Greatest Criminal Mind is a very reactive card. Even though we have 4 Queens versus the 3 we had a minute ago, we really just don't want dead cards in our hand, and that's really what it's going to be. If they're landing Tamatoas, it's unlikely we're going to be able to piece together a win anyway, or we should just be ending the game within the 1 turn that we were given after they play the Tamatoa. Slight variation to this deck could be -1 Cinderella. I like 3 because I like threatening it. I think that you will see a lot of steel decks. You will see a lot of either blue steel, which we've talked about. If you see that, green steel and amber steel, all those decks are very vulnerable to Cinderella Stout-Hearted. Often it will be ink, and that's fine. You have a lot of inkable cards. It's better than some cards that are not inkable you can play. But having access to 3 of these versus 2, which most of us play, I think is a big deal for helping fight some of the steel mirror matches you'll play. You need to win both games. So sometimes getting lucky isn't enough, even though you will have to get lucky. Having extra powerful cards in your deck can be enough to win games. And you're not really planning on casting this for 7, but making your Cinderellas more vulnerable and more threatening, not vulnerable, in the mid to late game is something you really want to do when you're playing cards like Piglet. So maybe they have to focus on Piglet, challenging that, leaving the Cinderella down. Well, you've quested for 3 there. Now your Cinderella's questing for 3 when you shift again, and having more copies of that could help close the game out in a faster manner. The same breakdown of Benjas, Rapunzels, and Ariels as before. There's no real difference in that. Benja serves a similar function. It's not ideal. You can play 2, you can play 3. Bare Necessities is pretty good at nabbing and Be Prepared at the right time, or even a Queen's Castle at times against the Amethyst decks can be relevant. In general, with this deck, you don't want to keep many of your songs against the Emerald decks because you're a little bit more vulnerable than the decks with a Lantern to not being able to go to a later game, because this deck wants to play out an aggressive game plan, so it plays out of the hand a bit more and relies on the card draw from the Stormy John and Hole World a little bit more than Lanterns do because there's no beast in this deck. That being said, this deck can certainly go to a later point in the game, and the best part about shift cards in general is they're just fine to cast for their full cost anyway. Robin Hood's a fine card even without shift. It's incredible with shift, but it's fine. And Cinderella for the same reasons. It's unlikely you'll get to 7, but it can happen with a couple of whole new worlds along the way. And one of the best things to do in the mid to late game is just drop a Smee and a Piglet. 2 cards is 5 lore. That's a ton of pressure. One thing to note as well with the deck and how to play this deck in particular is making a correlation to a mechanic from Magic called Suspend, where you essentially pay a upfront cost, and then a turn or so later, however many Suspend counters it gets, you then get the effect. All of your characters in this deck have the ability to gain lore on a 1-turn delay typically. There's no way to instantly gain lore with your characters. However, with a card like Sleepiest Flute, it is really important to note that you can use your effects of your spells on a later turn to get the immediate lore, where you have to wait a full turn with your characters. So sometimes developing your characters as a priority and controlling the board is much more important than getting Sleepiest Flute activations in. And again, why I think there's only 3 copies here and why I would only play 3 is that you don't prioritize the flute part of the deck as much. You really want to utilize it as a way to close the game. And if you happen to draw 2 or even 1, you play it, but you want to prioritize other aspects of the board and the game a little bit more. But it's a fine deck. I think the inclusions of the deck are solid. Mr. Smee is a really powerful character. Questing for 2 and surviving attacks from Mim is incredible. And a couple captains in the form of Piglet are nice. And late game, I've had games where I hold in the world, have a couple ink up, and then I just deployed 2 Piglets, and I had both them in the hand. That's the whole in the world. And yeah, just threatening 6 lore. Piglet's an incredible character, and in a much more aggressive non-whole in the world version of the deck, I'd play 4. But those are few and far between. I think whole in the world is too powerful of a card not to play more of. But no, these have been the 2 decks that in Amber Steel I think I would recommend. I may be playing one of them. Less likely the flute version, but if I expect more of Ruby Sapphire, which I do expect a good deal of, and I feel like I can contain the main difference between these 2 decks here is that this deck has a much better game plan against Emerald Amethyst than the flute version because of Tinkerbell, specifically because of Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell is an incredible card against Curse from Revoke, and it makes questing almost impossible for them, especially when they have no ways to remove the character. This version of the deck still is advantaged against Emerald Amethyst, but not by as much. It's definitely more winnable for them because you don't have the characters that impact the same way. Your more expensive characters don't have an immediate effect like Tinkerbell does, and aren't immediately demanding an answer all the time like Beast is. So that's the big line there. If you want to be a little bit more focused against some decks, which you may want to be because of it being a 2-game format and the importance of winning every single game, this may give you a better shot. Even maybe cutting the Sleepiest Flute for another copy of Grab Your Swords. If you really just want to hammer on and say, I'm just going to lose to Ruby Sapphire, and that's that, I would then remove the Sleepiest Flute and give yourself another Grab Your Swords, and then you'll probably have a good time playing against everything except for Ruby Sapphire. But I do expect it to be one of the most played decks at the event for sure. So we'll see. But if this is the way you want to do it, and you want to just focus in on and being able to beat pretty much anything, including Ruby Sapphire, which you're not strictly advantaged when you play Sleepiest Flute, but it's much closer just to 50-50 of how the game's going to play out. They can turn the corner a bit more reliably because you don't have as many threatening characters like Beast. They don't have to take the time off to answer all the cards like Robin Hood at points of the game, and they can just jam a Tamatoa when they feel like in some situations. But they both have their ups and downs, and these are the 2 decks I think that I'm most debating between. There's a stint of me that wanted to play Ruby Amethyst, but I think I'm going to be playing Amber Steel just because I have so much familiarity with it. I just don't know which version. And my heart wants me to play the Lantern version, but my head is in some ways telling me to play the Flute version, even though I don't recommend it as a whole for the format. But having a better game against one of the more popular decks is probably a good idea. We're not giving up too much points against the Emerald Sapphire decks might matter. Against Green Steel also, this deck's a little bit worse than the Lantern version. Sure, they can Benja either Flute or Lantern, but the deck without Lantern as a possibility for it certainly can kind of feel a little bit clunky when they just Benja your thing on turn 3 if they have 3 copies of Benja or something, and then your Tinkerbells and Cinderellas never see the light of day. But we'll see. This has been Amber Steel, and I hope you guys enjoyed this, my kind of last 2 decks to go through here. Those are all the 7 decks that I recommend playing. There's 7 archetypes that I think are reasonable and that I would not fault anyone for choosing. My takes on them, certain kind of important cards to note. Again, if you make different decisions than me, that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means we have a different expectation of what to play against. If you expect to play against certain decks more so than others, my list would probably be Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, and then right behind that, Emerald Amethyst or Green or Emerald Steel. Those are the next 2. And then beyond those is actually going to be matchups against Flute or Lantern, and then maybe Mufasa and then Blue Steel. Those are kind of the tiers there from top to bottom of what I expect to play against. And if I'm gunning for those top 2 decks, which I think are going to be the Ruby variants, I think that the Flute is going to be a better option against them more consistently to be able to win games on the play or draw. So that's where we're at. Hope you guys like this, and if I haven't already, make plans in the Discord we have here. You can, for my Patreon, there's a Discord link once you join it. It may need to be refreshed at certain times, so please let me know if it needs to be refreshed. Yeah, we'll see you guys in Atlanta, and hopefully for a future match, maybe if I'm doing well enough, or maybe just round 1 if they just want to make sure that I get one because I'll lose a bunch, but we'll see. But if not, see you guys at Atlanta, and then see you after that in set 4. Thanks, everyone.